Chapter 1. Before Massachusetts was Massachusetts. Long before a single Puritan boot touched the rocky shores of New England, before the Mayflower cast its anchor in what would become Plymouth Harbor, and centuries before Boston's skyline ever pierced the horizon, the land we now call Massachusetts thrived under the care of its original stewards, the indigenous nations of the Northeast. This was not an empty wilderness awaiting European civilization. It was already a world alive with meaning, memory, and mastery. In the centuries before European contact, the forests, rivers, and coasts of Massachusetts were home to vibrant and deeply rooted native cultures, especially the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts peoples. These were not scattered bands of nomads, but complex, organized societies with systems of governance, trade, spirituality, diplomacy, and war. Their stories are not footnotes to the history of Massachusetts. They are its beginning. The Wampanoag, whose name means people of the first light, lived across southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island. As the sun rose from the east over Cape Cod Bay, they saw themselves as the first to greet it each day, a poetic truth embedded in the very land they lived upon. They were skilled farmers, fishermen, and hunters who shaped the land intentionally, clearing forest undergrowth with fire to make way for deer, cultivating the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in rich soil, and rotating their fields to keep them fertile. The landscape itself was not untouched wilderness. It was curated, managed, and known intimately. Further north and inland, around the shores of the great bay that would one day bear the name Boston, lived the Massachusetts people. The very people whose name would eventually be given to the entire colony and state. Their name likely meant "at the Great Hill," or "people of the Big Hill," referring to the Blue Hills region south of modern-day Boston. Like the Wampanoag, they lived in villages, not camps, often composed of dozens of wetus, dome-shaped homes made from saplings and bark, arranged around shared spaces for council, trade, and ceremony. These nations were part of the larger Algonquian-speaking world, a cultural and linguistic network stretching across much of northeastern North America. And they were not isolated. Long before the English came, the peoples of Massachusetts were trading with the Narragansett to the west, the Nipmuc in central Massachusetts, the Abenaki in the north, and even the powerful Iroquois Confederacy to the west of the Hudson River. Wampum, intricately carved and polished shells, served not only as ceremonial objects, but as a medium of exchange, diplomacy, and record-keeping. Social life revolved around the seasons. In spring, communities moved toward rivers and coastal estuaries to fish for alewives and shad, building weirs and traps to gather food in abundance. Summer brought planting, gathering, and often inter-tribal gatherings for trade and diplomacy. In autumn, the focus shifted to harvest and preparation. And winter was a time for storytelling, for the passing down of oral traditions, when elders spoke of creation, myths, heroes, and the teachings of the natural world. Stories that explained not just how the world worked, but how to live within it. Leadership was not autocratic. Most tribes were led by a sachem, a chief, whose power rested not in brute force, but in persuasion, wisdom, and the ability to provide for and protect the people. Sachems were chosen from noble lineages, but could be removed if they failed. Women held significant authority, especially in choosing leaders and preserving the clan's identity through matrilineal lines. The balance of power between genders was not perfect, but it was far more reciprocal than what the arriving Europeans were accustomed to. Spirituality was embedded in every act. There was no clear division between the sacred and the mundane. The land was alive with spirits. Animals, trees, rivers, and rocks were all part of a spiritual ecosystem. Shamans, or powwows, acted as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual world. Dreams were taken seriously. Ceremonies honored the change of seasons, successful hunts, coming of age, and death. Life was seen as a circle. Everything returned. Everything was connected. But this world, so intricate and enduring, was already in jeopardy before the Pilgrims ever arrived. The first waves of European contact, beginning in the early 1500s with explorers, fishermen, and slavers, brought devastating change. Diseases like smallpox, leptospirosis, hepatitis, and influenza swept through native villages with horrifying speed and mortality. Lacking immunity to these foreign pathogens, entire communities were wiped out within weeks. In some areas of coastal Massachusetts, up to 90% of the indigenous population died in the years between 1616 and 1619. A cataclysm so complete that many of their villages lay empty, just as the Mayflower was arriving. To the English, these open fields and cleared lands appeared as divine providence, signs that God had prepared the land for their taking. In reality, they were ghost villages, the remnants of a society already ravaged by biological apocalypse. The landscape seemed ready, but only because its caretakers had been removed by invisible plagues. One of those survivors was a man named Tisquantum, better known today as Squanto. A member of the Patuxet tribe, itself a part of the Wampanoag Confederation. He had been kidnapped by English slavers years earlier, taken to Europe, learned English, and somehow made his way back home, only to find his entire village gone, wiped out by disease. When the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, they unknowingly settled directly on the ruins of Patuxet. It was Tisquantum who famously helped the Pilgrims survive their first brutal winter, showing them how to fertilize corn with fish, where to find food, and how to communicate with nearby tribes. But his role was more than that of a friendly translator. He was navigating a delicate web of power, trying to regain status, influence, and safety in a world where his people had been decimated and rival tribes were growing stronger. Central to this new diplomatic game was Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. He saw the weakened English settlers not just as desperate foreigners, but as potential allies in his own strategic chessboard, especially as the rival Narragansett to the west remained strong and untouched by disease. In 1621, Massasoit made a political decision that would reshape history. He entered into a peace treaty with the English. This fragile alliance would hold, more or less, for over 50 years. But this moment belongs to a different chapter. For now, we remember that Massachusetts, before it was a colony, before it was a battlefield, before it was a state, was a land of deeply rooted civilizations. Its forests echoed with prayer and laughter. Its rivers were highways and hunting grounds. Its soil was seeded with corn, story, and ceremony. The people of the first light had shaped the land for millennia, and in many ways, they still do. The story of Massachusetts does not begin with the Pilgrims. It begins with the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Nipmuc, the Pocumtuck, and others, with their fires, their memory, and their unbroken bond to the land. As we turn to the next chapter and watch European sails cut across the Atlantic, we do so knowing that the story they enter is already ancient. Because when the English stepped ashore in 1620, they were not discovering a new world. They were entering someone else's. Chapter 2. The Puritan Dream. When the Mayflower appeared on the gray horizon in the fall of 1620, it wasn't hope that filled the air. It was desperation. On board were 102 weary passengers, battered by weeks of violent Atlantic storms, their supplies dwindling, their plans unraveling. They were supposed to land somewhere near the Hudson River, but poor navigation and bad weather had driven them off course. What they found instead was the wind-bitten coast of Cape Cod, and a fate they hadn't intended in a land they did not fully understand. They were called Pilgrims, though not at first. That term would only gain popularity years later. To their contemporaries, they were simply separatists, English men and women who believed the Church of England was too corrupt to be purified. Unlike Puritans, who still hoped to reform the church from within, these separatists had given up on England's religious establishment altogether. That decision made them dangerous. In the early 1600s, England was not a place of religious tolerance. Dissenters were imprisoned, fined, or worse. The separatists fled to Holland, where they found religious freedom, but little else. They feared that their children were becoming too Dutch, that their culture and English identity were dissolving in the tolerance they had once craved. And so, they looked west to the Americas. Not just for survival, but for salvation. What they sought was nothing less than a New Jerusalem, a place where they could live out the pure gospel, uncorrupted and unchallenged. The journey was harrowing. Crammed aboard the Mayflower, a cargo ship never meant to carry families, they battled disease, dampness, and doubt. When they finally saw land in November 1620, it should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, they faced a new crisis. They were outside the bounds of the Virginia Company's charter. Technically, they had no legal authority to settle here. The possibility of mutiny stirred. Who, after all, was really in charge? To restore order and purpose, they drafted a short but revolutionary document, the Mayflower Compact. It was not a constitution in the modern sense, but it was radical for its time. A simple agreement that they would govern themselves by majority rule. In a world of monarchs and divine right, the idea that ordinary people could band together to create laws, not because of royal decree, but out of mutual consent, was extraordinary. It was the beginning, in a quiet and fragile way, of democracy in America. They settled in the ruins of Patuxet, the once thriving Wampanoag village now hollowed out by plague. They called it Plymouth. The first winter was brutal. Nearly half of the settlers died from cold, hunger, or disease. Graves were dug at night to hide their losses from any watching natives. The line between colony and extinction was paper-thin. And yet, somehow, they endured. Much of that survival was thanks to the indigenous people they encountered, especially Tisquantum, Squanto, who taught them how to farm corn, fish the local rivers, and survive in this new world. Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy, forged an uneasy but lasting peace with the newcomers. It was a relationship built not on affection, but on mutual benefit and necessity. The story of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving would later become mythologized, turned into a symbol of cooperation and gratitude. But the reality was more fragile, more fraught. The Wampanoag were not welcoming hosts. They were shrewd strategists trying to preserve their own power amid a changing world. And the Pilgrims, far from being self-sufficient pioneers, were utterly dependent on their indigenous allies. Still, the Plymouth colony survived, and its success sparked a much greater migration. By the 1630s, a new wave of settlers was arriving. Not separatists this time, but Puritans. Unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans didn't want to abandon the Church of England. They wanted to fix it. They believed England was falling into moral decay, and the Church had become too ceremonial, too corrupt, too Catholic. But rather than revolt, they would retreat to build a model society in the New World. A purified church, a holy community, a shining example that might someday reform the old country by its mere brilliance. In 1630, 11 ships carrying nearly 1,000 Puritans arrived in New England, led by a stern but visionary lawyer named John Winthrop. Unlike the Pilgrims, the Puritans were better financed, better organized, and far more ambitious. They didn't just want to survive. They wanted to build. Before stepping off the Arbella, Winthrop delivered a sermon that would echo through American history. A model of Christian charity. In it, he described their mission not as one of escape, but of divine purpose. "We shall be as a city upon a hill," he proclaimed, "a community watched by the world, accountable to God, judged by their success or failure. If they lived righteously, they would prosper. If not, they would be cursed." It was both a warning and a promise, and it planted deep within the American psyche the idea that this new land had a special destiny, a divine mission to be an example to others. The Massachusetts Bay Colony quickly became the most powerful settlement in New England. Boston, its heart, was founded almost immediately, a rocky peninsula that jutted into the bay, easy to defend and rich in natural resources. Within a generation, Massachusetts had become the dominant economic, religious, and political force in the region. But this was not a place of tolerance. The Puritans had come for religious freedom, their own, not yours. They built churches and schools, enforced strict morality, and punished dissent. Those who challenged the orthodoxy, whether Quakers, Baptists, or freethinkers, were fined, banished, or worse. Roger Williams, a Puritan minister who argued for separation of church and state, was driven out and founded Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson, a midwife who dared to preach her own interpretations of Scripture, was exiled and later killed in New York. The Puritan dream was disciplined, ordered, and unforgiving. Still, within that rigid framework, they built institutions that would endure. Harvard College was founded in 1636, just 6 years after Boston. The first printing press in North America appeared in Cambridge. Town meetings, where male church members voted on local affairs, laid the groundwork for participatory government. Literacy was widespread, driven by the belief that every person should be able to read the Bible. For all their intolerance, the Puritans produced a remarkably educated and civically active society. Their government blurred the line between church and state. Ministers held no formal political office, but their influence was vast. Laws were based on Scripture. Moral offenses, swearing, drunkenness, missing church, could lead to public punishment. Stocks, fines, and whippings were common. There was order, and there was fear. But there was also community. In a world of uncertainty and wilderness, the Puritans built something sturdy, a society that believed deeply in its mission and its covenant with God. As more settlers arrived, Massachusetts expanded rapidly. New towns sprang up across the colony, linked by trade, religion, and kinship. The Puritan model was spreading, and yet, beneath the surface, tensions were building. The land was not empty. The native nations were still here, watching as forests disappeared and villages multiplied. The uneasy peace with the Wampanoag was holding, but for how long? Dissent within the colony was growing louder. Some settlers began to question the harsh rules, the exclusionary politics, the tight grip of church leaders. Others looked to the west, to the open frontier, and saw opportunity, not obligation. But those are threads for another time. For now, the Puritan dream was alive. The city upon a hill was being built. One wooden church, one town meeting, one sermon at a time. It was a society forged in purpose, driven by faith and shadowed by fear. And though the world would change, the Puritans left their mark on everything that followed. Massachusetts was no longer just a place. It was an idea, one that would both inspire and haunt the generations to come. Chapter 3. Faith and Fire. The Puritan dream had taken root. Towns rose like sentinels across the Massachusetts landscape, and Boston pulsed with the energy of purpose. Church bells rang over cobbled streets, and in wooden meeting houses, sermons cracked like thunder. This was a land forged in covenant, with God, with community, and with conscience. But there was a cost to building a holy city. Faith could inspire, but it could also burn. Massachusetts in the 1600s was not merely a religious community. It was a theocracy in practice, if not in name. Civil law and spiritual doctrine were inseparable. To sin was to disobey God, and to disobey God was to threaten the entire community. In a land where survival was fragile and divine favor was everything, deviation wasn't tolerated. It was feared. And yet, dissent came. It always does. The first real crack in the Puritan wall arrived in the form of a man, Roger Williams, a brilliant and stubborn minister with ideas too bold for Boston. He arrived in 1631, already a Puritan but more radical than his peers. He believed in religious freedom, not just for himself, but for everyone. Catholics, Jews, even native peoples. In his view, forced religion was no religion at all. He spoke out loudly and often. He criticized the colony's leaders for taking native land without payment. He argued that the civil government had no right to punish people for violations of the first 4 commandments, the ones that dealt with a person's relationship to God. That was God's domain, not man's. To the Puritan elite, these ideas were not just rebellious, they were dangerous. In 1635, after months of mounting tension, the General Court of Massachusetts banished Williams. But he didn't go quietly. He fled into the winter woods, barely surviving, and found refuge among the Narragansett tribe. There he purchased land and founded a new settlement, Providence, which would later become part of Rhode Island. A colony built on the principles of religious liberty and separation of church and state. It was, in many ways, America's first truly free society. Not long after Williams's exile, another voice rose, softer in tone but even more provocative. Her name was Anne Hutchinson. She was a midwife, a mother of 15, and a woman of astonishing intellect and charisma. In the male-dominated world of Puritan New England, Anne did something revolutionary. She began to host meetings in her home, discussing scripture, sermons, and theology. Her audience grew quickly, and soon dozens were gathering to hear her thoughts on grace, salvation, and the limits of clerical authority. Anne believed in what was called the covenant of grace, that salvation came through faith alone, not through strict adherence to laws or the approval of ministers. That was not heresy, at least not by Reformation standards. But she took it a step further. She claimed that many ministers in Massachusetts were preaching a false gospel, one of works, not grace. And she claimed that she had received direct revelations from God. That for the Puritan establishment was intolerable. Not just because she was a woman asserting spiritual authority in a society that expected female silence, but because she threatened the unity and therefore the survival of the entire colony. A divided church was a vulnerable colony, and Anne Hutchinson had become a lightning rod. She was arrested and put on trial in 1637. A grueling interrogation in which she defended herself with a stunning combination of poise and scripture. For 2 days, she held her ground. But when she spoke of her visions, when she claimed that God had spoken to her directly and told her of her election, the court had what it needed. She was banished. Anne fled to Rhode Island, like Roger Williams before her, and later to New York. There, in a tragic twist of fate, she and several of her children were killed in a native raid. To her enemies in Massachusetts, it was confirmation of God's judgment. To history, it remains a symbol of the dangers and the costs of speaking against power. But Anne and Roger were only the beginning. Massachusetts would spend the next several decades wrestling with its own contradictions. A community built on conscience, yet intolerant of individual conscience. A society that preached grace, yet punished deviation with iron law. Nowhere would those contradictions explode more violently than in the small town of Salem. By the time the Salem Witch Trials began in 1692, Massachusetts was a very different colony than the one John Winthrop had envisioned. It was richer, larger, and more fragmented. The original generation of godly founders was dying out, and with them, the spiritual certainty that had once held the colony together. The frontier was expanding. Native wars had brought bloodshed and fear, and the colony was now under direct royal control. A charter had replaced the old Puritan governance, and the king's influence loomed large. In that anxious, shifting world, fear began to fester. It started in the winter in the home of Reverend Samuel Parris. His daughter and niece began to have strange fits, convulsions, screaming, and trances. The town's doctor could find no physical cause, and so he offered a diagnosis that would ignite a fire: witchcraft. Under pressure, the girls named their tormentors. The first 3 accused were a slave woman named Tituba, a homeless beggar named Sarah Good, and a poor old woman named Sarah Osborne. All 3 were marginalized. All 3 were easy targets. And all 3 were swept into a tidal wave of hysteria that would soon consume the town. Accusations spread rapidly. People turned on neighbors. Old grudges became deadly evidence. The courtroom became a theater of the absurd. Spectral evidence, dreams, and hearsay were accepted as proof. Over the course of months, more than 200 people were accused, and 20 were executed, mostly by hanging. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death with heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea. The governor eventually stepped in to halt the madness, disbanding the special court and forbidding spectral evidence. But the damage had been done. Families were destroyed, reputations shattered, and the colony had been forced to confront the monstrous shadow that could grow from its own ideals, because the Salem Witch Trials weren't just about superstition. They were the extreme end of the same religious rigidity that had banished Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams. In a world where spiritual unity was survival, dissent became sin, and sin became danger. It was a world where fear, wrapped in piety, could justify almost anything. After Salem, the colony began to change. Theocratic control began to loosen. Religious tolerance expanded. Harvard-educated ministers gave way to Enlightenment thinkers. But the scars of those years ran deep. Even today, the word Salem conjures images of paranoia, injustice, and the terrible cost of moral certainty turned into law. It is a haunting chapter, not just in the story of Massachusetts, but in the American story writ large. Yet it must be remembered, because for all their faults, the Puritans were human, flawed, devout, afraid, and brave. They built something remarkable, but they also burned people to protect it. Their world was one of black and white, but their legacy is gray. The fire that lit their city upon a hill also consumed it, again and again. And still, Massachusetts endured. As the 18th century approached, the colony would begin to shed its Puritan skin, step into new ideas, and play a central role in a coming conflict that would shake the world. But before the Revolution came industry, and before liberty came labor, the mills would rise, the cities would grow, and the past, full of faith and fire, would echo in every new brick, because no place forgets its ghosts, and Massachusetts, more than most, has many. Chapter 4. Commerce, Cotton, and Cod. As the flames of spiritual fervor flickered and cooled in the late 1600s, Massachusetts began to find its new rhythm, not in the pulpit, but in the port. The colony that had been built on covenant and conformity was now pulsing with movement. Ships docking, goods changing hands, sails unfurling into the Atlantic wind. Trade, not theology, was becoming the new language of survival and ambition. Massachusetts, by its very geography, was born to be a maritime power. Its jagged coastline offered countless harbors. Its rivers cut deep into the interior, and the cold waters off its shores teemed with fish, especially cod, which would become the first great engine of wealth for the colony. It was said that you could almost walk across the water on their backs, so abundant were they. These fish weren't just food. They were currency, they were trade, and eventually, they were empire. From the early 1600s onward, New England fishermen salted and dried cod on the shores of Cape Ann, Marblehead, and Gloucester. They shipped the product south to the Caribbean, where it fed enslaved laborers on sugar plantations, and east to Europe, where fasting Catholics saw it as a staple. Cod was the quiet king of the colonial economy, not glamorous, but dependable, exportable, and endlessly renewable, or so it seemed. But cod alone wasn't enough. As towns became cities and Puritan farms turned into trading posts, Massachusetts' economy began to diversify. And no industry captured its new ambitions more clearly than shipbuilding. Massachusetts had all the raw materials it needed. Endless forests of oak and pine, fast-flowing rivers for powering sawmills, and skilled craftsmen trained in old-world techniques. By the mid-17th century, towns like Newburyport, Salem, and especially Boston were bustling with the clanging of hammers and the smell of pitch and sawdust. Yards launched schooners, brigs, and sloops that were fast, efficient, and in high demand. These ships weren't just built for local fishing. They were meant to travel, and they did. It was through these vessels that Massachusetts became enmeshed in what historians call the triangular trade, a transatlantic commercial system that moved goods, people, and wealth in a vast, looping web. The triangle connected New England, West Africa, and the Caribbean. From Massachusetts and its northern neighbors went fish, lumber, rum and tools. To Africa went rum and manufactured goods. From Africa came enslaved human beings, millions of them, destined for the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean and the American South. And from those plantations came sugar, molasses, and cash crops, many of which returned to New England's ports. Massachusetts, though often remembered as a beacon of abolition in later centuries, was deeply complicit in this early economy of bondage. While enslaved Africans were less numerous in New England than in the South, slavery was very much present. Wealthy Boston families kept black servants in their homes. Merchants insured slave ships. Rum distillers in Massachusetts relied heavily on molasses produced by enslaved labor in the Caribbean. And many fortunes, the very foundations of Boston's elite, were built atop this unspoken traffic. Names that now adorn city squares and college buildings were, in some cases, tied directly to this machinery. The economy was not innocent. It was efficient. At the heart of it all was Boston, already the hub of New England. Its waterfront was a theater of ambition, its streets loud with traders, dockhands, apprentices, and laborers. Warehouses stacked with West Indian sugar, New Hampshire lumber, and Virginian tobacco lined the wharves. Taverns were filled with sailors from distant ports, and newspapers, letters, and gossip passed between coffee houses as fast as the wind. But commerce did more than fill purses. It began to transform the identity of the colony itself. The original Puritan ideal had been one of simplicity, austerity, and communal purpose. Now, a new class of merchant entrepreneurs was rising. Men who measured success not in scriptural purity, but in ships and shillings. Their god was trade. Their cathedral was the marketplace. And their morality, while still cloaked in Christian language, often bowed to the necessities of profit. Still, not all commerce was tied to the distant triangle. Much of Massachusetts' economy grew locally, in its fields, forests, and town markets. Farmers in the interior produced grains, apples, and livestock that fed growing towns. Blacksmiths and coopers worked in small shops. Sawmills hummed along cold rivers. And in homes across the countryside, women spun wool and flax into thread, contributing labor that was vital but often invisible. Cottage industries, barter economies, and seasonal fairs kept the rural parts of Massachusetts linked to the commercial life of its coastal centers. Goods flowed inward and outward. And with every exchange, every bag of flour, every barrel of salted mackerel, a new society was quietly taking shape. One that blended survival with surplus, craftsmanship with commerce, and tradition with change. Then came cotton. Though Massachusetts would not become truly industrialized until the 19th century, the seeds of that revolution were already being sown in the colonial era. Cotton, grown in the South, began arriving in larger quantities by the late 1700s, and New Englanders, known for their ingenuity, were among the first to experiment with mechanized weaving. The textile mills would come later, in full force, in places like Lowell and Lawrence. But already, you could sense a shift. The land was still important, but more and more, it was the machine, the market, and the network that ruled. And beneath it all, always, was the sea. Massachusetts was never far from water. Its economy rose and fell with the tides. Even inland towns knew that their future depended on what came in and out of the ports. Fishing continued to play a central role, not just cod, but herring, mackerel, and later whaling. Whaling, though not yet dominant in this early period, was beginning to make inroads. Nantucket and New Bedford would rise as whaling centers in the coming century. But already, The call of the ocean was shaping the colonial mind. Sailors from Massachusetts were renowned for their skill. They navigated not just the Atlantic, but the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and even the West African coast. Some became pirates. Others became privateers. Still others, respectable traders with the occasional shady deal. The lines were blurry, but the ambition was clear. To grow, to trade, to win. This thirst for profit also brought new pressures. Wealth, once viewed with suspicion by Puritan leaders, was now seen as a sign of providence. A man's success in business was often equated with his moral worth. Charity remained important, especially within one's church or town. But inequality began to grow. A new elite emerged, often tied by blood and marriage, who controlled shipping, property, and influence. Their homes, larger, more ornate, dotted the hills around Boston. Their sons went to Harvard. Their names filled the records of town meetings and trade ledgers alike. And yet, poverty persisted. Not everyone benefited from the boom. Dock workers, indentured servants, apprentices, and enslaved people labored in the shadows of growing prosperity. Fires swept through wooden cities. Economic panics came and went. And for many ordinary families, survival was still a daily struggle. Even as others grew rich in a world measured by barrels, cargo, and foreign demand. As the 18th century drew on, Massachusetts was no longer the isolated, God-fearing colony it had once been. It was a player in a global system. Its economy was tied to wars, empires, and prices set across oceans. Its ships crossed lines of language and law. And its people, once unified by religious purpose, were now divided by wealth, trade, and class. Still, the colony thrived. Its streets grew louder. Its towns grew denser. Its reach grew wider. And with every crate unloaded at the docks, with every barrel rolled down a wharf, with every contract signed under candlelight, Massachusetts was becoming something new. Not just a settlement, not just a church on a hill, but a society fueled by commerce. The pulpit had not disappeared, but it now shared space with the market. The sermon with the sales pitch. And in that convergence, in the quiet, relentless rhythm of cod, cotton, and coin, the future was already beginning to hum. Chapter 5. Boston becomes the battlefield. By the mid-1700s, Massachusetts was no longer just a colony. It was a pressure cooker. The sermons still echoed in churches, the ships still groaned at the docks, and the merchants still tallied profits by candlelight. But beneath the clamor of commerce and daily life, something older and more volatile stirred. The conviction that freedom meant self-rule, that British power, once welcomed, had become something else entirely. The people of Massachusetts, especially in Boston, were beginning to feel it. The slow tightening of an imperial grip. And like any grip, it would provoke a struggle. The British Empire had grown vast after its victories in the 7 Years' War. But it had also grown expensive. Parliament looked across the Atlantic and saw its North American colonies not just as subjects, but as sources of revenue. Massachusetts, with its busy ports and bristling economy, became a convenient target. Taxes and trade restrictions, crafted in London and enforced by redcoats, began to press down on colonial life. The colonists, many of whom had never even seen a British official until recently, were told they must now pay for their own protection. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first true flashpoint, requiring colonists to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper. Newspapers, contracts, even playing cards. It wasn't the money that burned most. It was the principle. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Why should people pay taxes to a parliament in which they had no voice? In Boston, opposition was not just intellectual. It was physical. Crowds took to the streets. Effigies of tax collectors were hung and burned. Mobs stormed the homes of officials. A secret group known as the Sons of Liberty emerged. Agitators, printers, craftsmen, and leaders like Samuel Adams, who organized resistance and stirred public opinion with fire and ink. In the taverns and newspapers of Boston, the idea of loyalty to the crown was beginning to crumble. Though the Stamp Act was repealed, the damage had been done. Trust was fraying. Parliament responded with new measures. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on imports like glass, paint, and tea. Again, Bostonians resisted. They boycotted British goods, encouraged local manufacturing, and protested in the streets. British troops, redcoats with polished muskets and blank stares, were sent to restore order. To the people of Boston, it felt like an occupation. Tensions simmered, fights broke out, words turned to shouts, shouts turned to stones, and then, one cold March evening in 1770, everything exploded. A crowd gathered near the custom house. Snowballs were thrown, some packed with ice or oyster shells. The soldiers, young and nervous, shouted warnings. Then someone, no one knows who, gave the order, or perhaps no order at all. The redcoats fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, whose name would later echo in the memory of freedom. The event would come to be known as the Boston Massacre, though the numbers were small. But it wasn't the number of dead that mattered. It was the message. British troops had fired on British subjects in the streets of Boston. Samuel Adams and others seized the moment. Paul Revere engraved a dramatic and exaggerated image of the event. Redcoats in a firing line, innocent colonists bleeding in the snow. The image raced through the colonies, printed and passed from hand to hand. It didn't need to be precise. It needed to be persuasive. For a time, the fires cooled. The Townshend Acts were partially repealed. But the tax on tea remained, a symbol of Parliament's right to rule. And when the British East India Company was granted a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, effectively undercutting colonial merchants, the anger returned, sharper than before. In December of 1773, Boston staged its most famous act of defiance. A group of colonists, some dressed as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships docked in the harbor. They worked quickly and quietly, lifting 342 chests of tea and dumping them into the dark water. The act was not just a protest. It was a message. This was no longer about taxes. It was about control. The Boston Tea Party, as it would later be called, shocked Britain. Parliament responded with fury. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, were passed in 1774. Boston Harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was revoked. Town meetings were restricted. British soldiers could now be quartered in private homes. The Crown had made its point, but so had the colonists. Rather than weakening resistance, the punishment united it. Across the colonies, support for Boston grew. Supplies were sent, letters circulated. Networks of communication, committees of correspondence, kept everyone informed. Outrage turned into organization. What had once been regional unrest was becoming a national movement. Massachusetts stood at the center. In 1775, General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, ordered troops to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, about 20 miles inland from Boston. But the Patriots had spies too. The Sons of Liberty learned of the plan and decided to act. On the night of April 18th, a silversmith named Paul Revere mounted his horse and began his famous ride. His destination wasn't just Concord, it was every village along the road. His cry, "The British are coming!" may be more legend than fact, but the warning was real. Revere, along with William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, alerted the countryside. When the Redcoats marched the next morning, they found not surprise, but resistance. In the small town of Lexington, British troops met a line of colonial militia, farmers, tradesmen, townsfolk, standing nervously with muskets. No one knows who fired the first shot, but it was heard everywhere. The shot heard. Round the world, as Emerson would later call it, marked the beginning of open war. 8 colonists were killed on Lexington Green. The British pressed on to Concord and met a different fate. At Concord's North Bridge, militiamen fired back. The Redcoats, shaken and outnumbered, began to retreat. But the countryside was awake now. Militia from dozens of towns swarmed the roads, firing from behind trees and stone walls. By the time the British staggered back to Boston, they had lost over 250 men. The colonial losses were half that. The age of protest had ended. The age of revolution had begun. Boston became the first battlefield. It was surrounded by colonial forces, trapped in a siege. Both sides dug in, waiting for the next move. But that chapter comes later. For now, it is enough to know that Massachusetts lit the match. That in the narrow streets of Boston, on the village greens of Lexington and Concord, the old world cracked open. It wasn't just about taxes or trade or distant kings. It was about identity. Who gets to rule? Who gets to decide what freedom means? Massachusetts didn't wait for permission to answer. Its people, from sailors and shopkeepers to ministers and farmers, turned their colony into a cause. Its cities became symbols. Its blood became the price of principle. And the world was watching. The city upon a hill had caught fire, and the flames were spreading. Chapter 6. Lexington, Concord, and the Siege of Boston. Dawn broke on April 19th, 1775, with musket smoke still hanging in the air and the distant echo of marching feet pounding the muddy roads of Massachusetts. Just hours earlier, the quiet fields of Lexington and Concord had become blood-soaked landmarks in the birth of something new, not just a rebellion, but a revolution. And now, there would be no going back. The retreat from Concord to Boston was more than a military withdrawal. It was a signal flare to the rest of the colonies. The British, confident in their authority, had expected to disarm a few disgruntled farmers. Instead, they encountered a population that had spent the winter preparing for this moment. Militia poured in from every town, every hamlet, every dirt road. They fired from behind trees, stone walls, and taverns. The Redcoats, humiliated and bloodied, stumbled into the city with casualties that stunned British command. Massachusetts, once a colony of dissenters and merchants, had become the beating heart of American resistance. Within days, thousands of armed militiamen surrounded Boston. What began as scattered retaliation was hardening into a siege. The British, led by General Thomas Gage, were trapped inside a city that had become a fortress. But the fortress wasn't theirs. They held Boston, but not the hills. They had ships, but not control. The countryside belonged to the rebels now, and the rebels were organizing. Militiamen who had never fought beyond their own town limits were suddenly turning into soldiers. Old friends became officers. Local blacksmiths became artillerymen. Farmers became generals overnight. The lines around Boston stretched, strengthened, and solidified. Tents sprang up on the surrounding hills. Powder and ball were rationed. The smell of gun oil and wet canvas hung in the spring air. It was in this moment of uncertainty that the idea of America as a united cause began to take shape. Though Massachusetts had acted first, it was not alone for long. Word of the battle spread like wildfire across the colonies. From Virginia to New York, newspapers printed exaggerated but electrifying accounts of British aggression and colonial bravery. Letters flew between leaders. What had once been grievances now became justification. The First Continental Congress had met the year before to protest British policies. Now, a second Congress would meet to decide something greater: how to fight. Back in Massachusetts, the rebels faced their first real test. Holding Boston was one thing. Driving the British out was another. The city, protected by ships and redcoats, sat low by the sea. But around it rose the highlands of Charlestown and Dorchester. And every soldier knew the truth. Whoever held the heights controlled the city. In June of 1775, the British decided to break the siege. Their plan was simple: take control of the high ground. On June 17th, British troops crossed the Charles River and attempted to seize Breed's Hill, mistakenly believing it to be Bunker Hill, which was the original target. The colonial forces, tipped off by spies and scouts, fortified Breed's Hill the night before, digging trenches and setting up makeshift earthworks with astonishing speed. When the British troops began their ascent, drums pounding and bayonets gleaming, they expected little resistance. What they got was a wall of colonial fire. The order passed down the rebel lines was simple: don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. It was not romantic. It was practical. Ammunition was scarce. When the volleys began, they tore through the British ranks. Waves of redcoats charged uphill again and again, only to be repelled by relentless musket fire. But the colonists, untrained and outgunned, could not hold forever. On the third British assault, their powder ran low. Hand-to-hand combat broke out. Blood soaked the hillside. Bodies fell in clusters. The rebels were forced to retreat. The British technically won the Battle of Bunker Hill, but it was a hollow victory. They lost over 1,000 men, officers, grenadiers, experienced troops, a staggering toll for ground that gave them little advantage. The colonists had lost the hill, but gained something far more valuable: belief. They had stood their ground. They had bled an empire. The myth of British invincibility was gone. Meanwhile, the command of the colonial forces was shifting. In July of 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He arrived in Cambridge to find a ragtag group of volunteers, brave but poorly armed, undisciplined, and uncertain. His job was to turn a militia into an army. Washington's first challenge was not the British. It was the lack of powder, the chaos of command, the internal politics, and the fear that this rebellion could still collapse at any moment. He inspected the lines, reorganized the troops, and brought a measure of seriousness to a cause still held together by hope and fury. Through the late summer and fall, the siege of Boston continued. Skirmishes broke out at the edges. Intelligence networks grew. Spies passed information from inside the city to rebel camps on the outskirts. Disease spread in both directions. The British, increasingly desperate, relied on naval supply lines and loyalist supporters, but they could not break out. Then came a turning point from an unlikely source. Far to the west, in upstate New York, a blacksmith's son named Henry Knox had seized Fort Ticonderoga, a British post loaded with heavy artillery. Knox, barely 25 years old, proposed a bold idea: drag those cannons, 60 in all, across hundreds of miles of frozen rivers, snow-covered mountains, and wilderness, all the way to Boston. Most thought it impossible, but Knox did it. Through the bitter winter of 1775 to 1776, oxen and sleds carried the cannons, some weighing over a ton, across the icy Northeast. In March, they arrived in Cambridge. Washington wasted no time. Under the cover of darkness, the cannons were dragged up Dorchester Heights, a bluff overlooking Boston and its harbor. When the sun rose on March 5th, 1776, the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, the British woke to find themselves staring down the barrels of American artillery. General William Howe, who had replaced Gage, knew he was outmaneuvered. Boston was no longer defensible. The ships in the harbor were exposed. The city could be shelled into oblivion. There was no choice. On March 17th, the British evacuated Boston. Redcoats and Loyalist families boarded ships and sailed away. For the first time since the rebellion began, the Americans had reclaimed a city. The victory was bloodless, but deeply symbolic. Boston, the birthplace of the Sons of Liberty, of protest, pamphlets, and tea dumped into dark water, had become the first major city freed from British control. Church bells rang. Militias marched through the streets. The people cheered not just for a battle won, but for a future that felt within reach. But the fight was only beginning. The war would rage on for years. Other cities would burn. Other battles would be lost and won. But Massachusetts had done more than fire the first shot. It had shown that revolution was not just an idea. It was a reality. That ordinary people, if united by conviction, could stand against the most powerful empire on earth. The colony was changing, in name, in spirit, in destiny. It was no longer just a patch of land granted by a distant king. It was becoming a cradle of liberty, rocked by sacrifice, watched by the world, and carried forward by those willing to risk everything. What began on a green field in Lexington, with nervous fingers gripping cold muskets, had become something much larger. A siege, a cause, a country in the making. And Massachusetts, scarred and proud, was leading the way. Chapter 7. Massachusetts after independence. When the last British ship slipped away from Boston Harbor in 1776, the cheers rang out not just for a military victory, but for something deeper. A dream of freedom finally made real. But freedom, as the people of Massachusetts would soon learn, came with its own burdens. It was one thing to defy an empire. It was another to replace it with something better. Massachusetts, so often at the vanguard of rebellion, now found itself at the vanguard of creation. The war for independence was still far from over. Battles raged in New York, Pennsylvania, and the South. But already, the question of what comes next loomed large. What kind of government should rise from the ruins of monarchy? Who would have a voice? Who would wield power? In 1780, as the Revolution pressed on, Massachusetts answered with a document that would set the tone for the future, not only of the state, but of the nation. It was the Massachusetts Constitution, largely written by John Adams, a lawyer from Braintree whose pen had already helped draft the Declaration of Independence. But Adams' state constitution went further. It was bold, structured, and visionary. The document established a strong separation of powers, executive, legislative, judicial, modeled after the classical ideals Adams so admired. It declared that all people were born free and equal, a phrase that would later echo through courtrooms and civil rights battles for centuries to come. And perhaps most importantly, it laid out a Bill of Rights, protecting the freedom of speech, the right to worship, and the right to petition. It was, in many ways, a blueprint for the future United States Constitution, which would not be ratified until nearly a decade later. Yet even as Massachusetts celebrated its high ideals on parchment, tensions simmered in its fields and villages. The war had drained resources. The economy was fragile. Taxes remained high. And for many veterans returning from service, especially those in western Massachusetts, the promised rewards of liberty felt more like debts and disappointment. They had fought for a republic, but what they returned to was something that looked, to them, all too familiar. A new elite had taken the place of the old, seated in Boston's parlors and courtrooms. Paper money was scarce, credit was tight, and courts were quick to seize property from farmers who couldn't pay. Land, once a symbol of independence, was now a source of foreclosure. And so, in the small towns beyond the reach of Boston's cobblestone streets, unrest began to grow. The storm finally broke in 1786. Led by Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolutionary War and a farmer from Pelham, hundreds of armed men began to organize across rural Massachusetts. They called themselves regulators, not rebels, and their demand was simple: economic justice, relief from debt, reform of taxation, a halt to the court system that was taking their land. In their eyes, they were not attacking the Republic. They were defending the very liberty they had bled for. The movement swelled. Courthouses were shut down. Judges were turned away. In Springfield, the rebels marched toward the federal arsenal, hoping to seize weapons and force change. The Massachusetts government, alarmed, raised a militia funded not by public tax dollars, but by private Boston merchants, and sent it to crush the rebellion. The confrontation came in January 1787. Shots were fired. The rebels scattered. Shays and many others fled to Vermont. The rebellion was over. But the message had landed. To the elite, Shays' rebellion was a terrifying wake-up call. It revealed the fragility of the new republic, the thinness of its authority, and the simmering resentment that still burned beneath the surface. If the revolution had been about the people's voice, what happened when that voice turned against the very system it helped create? To others, the rebellion was a cry of pain, a reminder that liberty was not secured by lofty documents alone, that political freedom meant little without economic fairness, that the same state that had once thrown off the yoke of British rule now had to ask itself whether it was repeating the same mistakes under a different flag. Massachusetts, shaken but not broken, absorbed the lesson. The government introduced some reforms, tax relief, legal protections. But more importantly, the rebellion forced a broader national conversation. Leaders like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton looked at the chaos in Massachusetts and concluded that the existing national government, the Articles of Confederation, were simply not strong enough. The states were too independent, the center too weak. The republic needed structure. And so, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention was called in Philadelphia. Massachusetts sent delegates, including Elbridge Gerry and Nathaniel Gorham, to help shape the new framework. The resulting U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1788, bore the fingerprints of Massachusetts' own earlier efforts. Separation of powers, checks and balances, a Bill of Rights. These were not new ideas for Massachusetts. They were already living law. Still, the process of ratification was not smooth. In Massachusetts, fierce debates erupted. Anti-Federalists feared the new Constitution gave too much power to a central government, the very kind of concentrated authority they had just fought to escape. Others, particularly in rural areas still raw from Shays' Rebellion, worried that their voices would be drowned out by the cities. But after heated town meetings, pamphlet wars, and promises of a future Bill of Rights, the state narrowly voted to ratify. It was a choice not just for structure, but for union, for the belief that the colonies, now states, were stronger together than apart. And so, Massachusetts entered a new chapter, no longer as a colony or a revolutionary battleground, but as a state within a growing nation. Its role shifted from defiance to definition. The fires of rebellion cooled, replaced by the slower work of governance, compromise, and civic identity. Yet the legacy of those early years remained. The identity of Massachusetts was now split between two powerful poles: the idealism of its founding principles and the realities of its social and economic tensions. It was a state of Harvard scholars and Concord farmers, of Boston merchants and Western debtors. It was both the writer of constitutions and the home of rebellion against them. And that contradiction would come to define its place in American history. In the years after ratification, Massachusetts invested in infrastructure, expanded its educational institutions, and watched as its sons and daughters began to shape national culture and politics. But it never forgot the lessons of its own fragile beginning: that liberty is not a single act, but a continuous struggle; that building a nation is harder than breaking one; and that identity, personal, state, and national, is forged not just in war, but in what follows after. The guns of the Revolution had gone silent, but the debates they sparked still rumbled beneath the surface. Who was a citizen? Who had a voice? What did freedom mean when the courts seized land or the markets collapsed? These questions did not vanish with independence. They only grew louder. Massachusetts, the cradle of rebellion, was now also the cradle of responsibility. It stood not just as the spark that lit a revolution, but as the workshop where the new republic hammered out its form. Its people had toppled kings, challenged each other, and drafted the blueprints for a new world. And now, the question that remained, for Massachusetts and for the nation, was whether they could live up to the promises they had written with such passion and at such cost. Chapter 8. The Cradle of Reform. The Revolution had given Massachusetts its independence, but the decades that followed would give it something even more enduring: a conscience. The muskets were stored away, the British banners long gone, and in their place came a different kind of battle, not for land or liberty, but for the very soul of the young republic. This time, the battlefield was the mind. The weapon was the word. And once again, Massachusetts would take the lead. By the early 19th century, the state was entering a new era. Boston had grown into a thriving port, its streets bustling with trade, literature, and political debate. Inland towns flourished with mills and railroads. The scars of war had healed into a quiet pride. But prosperity brought its own questions. What was the purpose of this new American freedom? Was it only for the wealthy? Only for the white? Was liberty simply the absence of tyranny, or the presence of justice? These questions stirred a movement. In the lecture halls, churches, and parlors of Massachusetts, a wave of reform began to rise. Not from government edict, but from personal conviction. The state that once dared to defy a king now dared to demand a better nation. One of the earliest and most lasting revolutions began not in politics, but in the classroom. Massachusetts, long known for its reverence for learning, became the birthplace of public education in America. At the forefront was Horace Mann, a lawyer from Franklin with a vision both simple and radical. That every child, regardless of wealth or class, deserved a quality education funded by the state. To Mann, education was not a luxury. It was the foundation of democracy. A republic, he argued, could not survive on ignorance. If liberty was to endure, it must be taught. Appointed as Secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837, Mann transformed the way the state, and eventually the nation, thought about schooling. He advocated for longer school years, better training for teachers, and standardized curriculum. He pushed for schoolhouses in every town, paid for by taxes, open to all. The common school movement was born, and with it, the belief that the mind was not just a private garden, but a public trust. Mann's crusade faced resistance, especially from those who feared centralized control or doubted the need for schooling among the poor. But the tide was turning. Massachusetts, by the mid-19th century, had become a beacon for educational reform, and its model would ripple across the country. A state once defined by sermons was now becoming defined by textbooks. But if Mann represented the structured civic side of reform, a different kind of revolution was unfolding just a few miles west of Boston, in the quiet woods and philosophical salons of Concord. It was there that Ralph Waldo Emerson, former minister, essayist, poet, and mystic, stood at the center of a movement that would challenge not just institutions, but the very nature of being. Emerson believed that truth did not reside in tradition or authority, but in the soul of each individual. To him, divinity was not locked in Scripture, but found in the rustle of leaves, the ripple of water, the quiet certainty of self-reliance. Emerson's writings, especially his famous essay Self-Reliance, called Americans to reject conformity and discover the sacred within. He urged them to see the world not as something to conquer or inherit, but to understand deeply, personally, spiritually. Surrounding Emerson in Concord was a circle of thinkers and writers who came to define the transcendentalist movement. They were not a political party, but a moral force. They believed in nature, intuition, and the inherent goodness of people. And none embodied their ideals more completely than Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, a restless soul and relentless observer, took Emerson's philosophy and lived it, literally. In 1845, he built a small cabin by the edge of Walden Pond and spent 2 years in deliberate simplicity. There he grew beans, watched birds, and wrote, not as escape, but as protest. His book Walden, published years later, would become a classic of American thought. A meditation on the tension between progress and peace, between economy and essence. But Thoreau's legacy would not rest in his bean rows. In 1846, outraged by the United States war with Mexico and its ties to slavery, he refused to pay a poll tax. Arrested and jailed overnight, he emerged with a short essay that would echo across continents: Civil Disobedience. The message was clear. When the state becomes unjust, the individual has a moral duty to resist, not violently, but with principle. His ideas would later inspire Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and movements of peaceful protest across the globe. Yet for all their poetry and principle, the transcendentalists were not insulated from the blood and chains of their time. Slavery, that brutal contradiction at the heart of the American experiment, cast its long shadow even over Massachusetts. And the fight to abolish it would become one of the state's fiercest and most defining struggles. Though Massachusetts had gradually outlawed slavery by the early 1800s, it remained deeply entangled in the nation's economic and political compromises. Cotton from the South fueled New England's mills. Federal laws demanded the return of fugitive slaves. And across the country, the question of slavery's future was tearing the Union apart. In this storm, Massachusetts became a sanctuary and a sword. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, a fiery Boston newspaper editor, took up the cause with uncompromising fervor. His publication, The Liberator, condemned slavery not just as a political wrong, but as a sin against God and man. Garrison did not plead for gradual change. He demanded immediate emancipation. He was radical, even among radicals, and he made enemies quickly. But he never stopped. His voice, loud and unrelenting, gave abolitionism a moral force that could not be ignored. Boston became a center of underground railroad activity. Black and white citizens risked their safety to hide, feed, and transport freedom seekers on their way to Canada. Churches opened their basements. Activists stood between slave catchers and their prey. When the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a federal crime to help runaway slaves, Massachusetts resisted, openly, defiantly. The state legislature passed laws to counter the federal mandate. Crowds blocked courthouse doors. In one infamous case, a man named Anthony Burns, a fugitive enslaved person, was arrested in Boston. Thousands of protesters flooded the city. Federal troops were called in. Burns was marched in chains to the harbor and returned to slavery. The image of it haunted the city. Donations flooded in to purchase his freedom. He would return to Massachusetts, this time a free man. From the docks of Boston to the woods of Concord, the call for a better nation rang louder than ever. Education, spiritual awakening, and moral resistance were no longer separate causes. They were threads in a single tapestry. A belief that America, unfinished and imperfect, could be something greater. And Massachusetts, restless and righteous, kept pushing forward. It taught children to read so they could think freely. It asked citizens to trust their conscience even when it contradicted the law. And it raised voices, sometimes loud, sometimes lyrical, to say that liberty meant more than breaking away from kings. It meant building a world worth being free in. The reformers did not all agree. They argued, drifted, sometimes failed. But their presence shifted the moral center of a nation. They made ideas into actions and actions into examples. They made Massachusetts not just a place where revolution had begun, but a place where evolution of thought, of justice, of identity never stopped. And as the clouds of civil war began to gather on the horizon, those ideas would be tested like never before. Chapter 9: Industry and Immigration. By the mid-19th century, the idealism of Massachusetts reformers echoed through lecture halls and print shops. But another, louder rhythm was rising beneath it: the relentless hum of machines. Steel met steam, and the waters of Massachusetts, once sacred to native tribes and poets alike, were now being harnessed to turn wheels, drive looms, and fuel an economic transformation that would reshape the state. The Industrial Revolution had arrived, and Massachusetts was once again at the center of change, not just in spirit, but in structure. It began in earnest along the Merrimack River, where the town of Lowell would become the model for American industrialization. Named after Francis Cabot Lowell, a visionary merchant who had studied textile mills in England, this new city was designed to fuse profit with morality. Brick by brick, canal by canal, Lowell rose out of the wilderness, not as a spontaneous village, but as a planned industrial utopia. At its heart were the textile mills, massive red brick buildings powered by water wheels, filled with rows of mechanical looms, and manned, or rather, womaned, by a new labor force. These were the Lowell Mill Girls, young women from rural New England farms who came seeking wages, independence, and experience. They lived in boarding houses under strict rules, curfews, church attendance, moral supervision, and worked long hours, 6 days a week, in conditions that were often loud, hot, and grueling. For a time, Lowell was held up as a shining example of industrial virtue. The factory system was seen not as exploitative, but as an opportunity. The mill girls wrote their own newspapers, attended lectures, and in some cases, saved enough to support their families or afford further education. But as demand rose and competition grew, the utopia began to crack. Wages were cut, hours grew longer, the air in the mills thickened with cotton dust. Machines moved faster. The mill girls, once quiet and obedient, began to organize. In 1834 and again in 1836, they staged some of the earliest labor strikes in American history, protesting wage reductions and the relentless pace of factory life. Though these early efforts were unsuccessful, they marked the beginning of a new consciousness, one that saw labor not just as toil, but as power. As the century turned, a new wave of workers began to replace the daughters of New England farms. Across the Atlantic, disaster struck Ireland. The Great Famine, beginning in 1845, sent waves of starving and desperate Irish immigrants across the ocean. Tens of thousands arrived in Boston with little more than rags and faith. They were met with suspicion, hostility, and signs that read, "No Irish need apply." To the native-born Protestants of Massachusetts, the Irish were alien, poor, Catholic, uneducated, and clannish. To the industrialists, however, they were exactly what the mills demanded. Workers who would take low wages, endure harsh conditions, and keep the looms spinning. The Irish settled in neighborhoods like South Boston and Charlestown, crowding into tenements, scraping by on factory wages, and facing discrimination at every turn. But they did not disappear into silence. They built churches, schools, and political networks. The Catholic Church became their anchor. Priests not only offered sacraments, but spoke against injustice. Slowly, the Irish began to rise. First as laborers, then as policemen, then as aldermen and ward bosses. Their numbers gave them political power, and their struggle forged a fierce loyalty to one another. Boston, once a bastion of Yankee Protestant culture, was changing. So was Lowell. So was Massachusetts. By the late 19th century, immigration had become the fuel of industry. Irish hands had laid the foundations, but they were soon joined by Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Armenians, Jews, and French Canadians. Each group brought its own language, customs, and grievances. They built tight-knit communities, sometimes at odds with one another, but all sharing a common experience. the grind of industrial life. The factories expanded. In places like Lawrence, Fall River, and Holyoke, towering smokestacks pierced the skyline. Children worked alongside their parents. Women stood for 12 hours at clattering machines. Men loaded freight, shoveled coal, or stitched boots. Industrial accidents were common. Wages were low. Bosses were distant. But the dream of a better life, however faint, kept them going. Massachusetts was no longer just a state of thinkers and rebels. It was a state of workers. And those workers, over time, began to find their voice. In 1912, that voice erupted in one of the most dramatic labor struggles in American history. The Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence. The textile mills had once again cut wages after a state law reduced the work week for women and children. Angry and exhausted, the workers, mostly immigrant women and teenagers, walked out. What made the strike remarkable was not just its size, but its diversity. Dozens of nationalities, speaking dozens of languages, united under a single cause. Banners called for bread and roses, a demand not just for survival, but for dignity. The strike lasted 9 weeks. Violence erupted. Police beat protesters. One woman was killed. But in the end, the strikers won a modest wage increase and national attention. The strike echoed through Massachusetts and through the country. It showed that industry was not immune to justice, that immigrants, long dismissed as replaceable, were capable of collective power, that Massachusetts, once the home of Puritan sermons and revolutionary speeches, was now the home of a new kind of fight. For fairness in the factory, for humanity in the age of machines. And still, the mills roared. Even as technology changed and new machinery arrived, the heart of Massachusetts beat in sync with its industrial rhythm. Railroads crisscrossed the state. Trolley lines spread outward. Boston became a modern metropolis, electrified, crowded, and noisy. Its neighborhoods swelled with the children of immigrants, whose parents spoke little English but believed in schools, hard work, and the promise of upward mobility. That promise was sometimes real, often elusive. Housing remained poor. Discrimination continued. Political power came slowly, but by the early 20th century, the children of mill workers were becoming clerks, shopkeepers, nurses, and teachers. Some went to college. Some entered city politics. Some, like the descendants of Irish immigrants, rose to positions once unimaginable, including the mayor's office, the governor's mansion, and eventually, the White House. Massachusetts had become a mosaic. The old Puritan bloodlines remained, but they were joined by Italian stonecutters, Jewish tailors, Portuguese fishermen, and Cape Verdean dock workers. The mills were fading, but the memory of labor endured. So did the tension between tradition and change, between wealth and labor, between native and newcomer. And yet, for all its clashes and contradictions, the Massachusetts of factories and immigrants had forged something extraordinary. A shared identity built not on ancestry, but on persistence. It was not a perfect melting pot. Prejudice and inequality remained, but the lines between us and them had begun to blur. What had once been a state founded by English Calvinists had become a state defined by plurality. Its power no longer flowed only from sermons or ships, but from sweat. From the hands of those who worked 12 hours and sent their children to school. From women who sewed flags by day and led strikes by night. From children who translated for their parents and then taught English to their neighbors. This chapter in Massachusetts history was not about heroes in powdered wigs or generals on horseback. It was about anonymous lives, endured, struggled, and eventually changed. The industrial age would not last forever. The mills would one day fall silent. The smokestacks would rust. But the people who powered them and the generations they raised would remain. And Massachusetts, once again, would evolve. Chapter 10. Massachusetts in the 20th century. The great mills had powered Massachusetts into modernity. But as the 20th century dawned, it was not the factory whistle that defined the rhythm of life. It was the clash between old identities and new ideas. Massachusetts, once a state built on religious covenant, then revolution, then reform, now found itself at a crossroads. The machines were slowing down. The immigrant families who had once labored in their shadow were growing restless. And the question hovering over every city, every street corner, every household was no longer just, who are we? But who do we want to become? At the start of the century, Massachusetts was both a symbol of American promise and a mirror of its contradictions. It had world-class universities, gleaming hospitals, and a political tradition rooted in civic duty. But it also had overcrowded housing, rising inequality, and simmering racial tensions. It had become a state with two faces, one progressive and intellectual, the other deeply conservative, protective of tradition and resistant to rapid change. Nowhere was this tension more visible and more painful than in the streets of Boston during the 1970s, when the battle over school desegregation erupted into what would become known as the Boston Buzzing Crisis. The conflict did not unfold in the Deep South, but in the liberal heart of the Northeast. It didn't happen in the era of slavery or Jim Crow, but in the so-called post-civil rights age. And that, perhaps, is what made it so explosive. The story began decades earlier, with the quiet persistence of segregation by neighborhood and policy. Though Massachusetts had no laws mandating separate schools by race, the result of decades of housing discrimination, redlining, and economic disparity was that black students in Boston, particularly in neighborhoods like Roxbury and Dorchester, were attending underfunded, overcrowded, and unequal schools. Promises of integration and reform had gone largely unfulfilled. Patience had worn thin. In 1974, a federal judge ruled that Boston schools were, in effect, segregated, and ordered an immediate remedy: busing students across the neighborhood lines to create racial balance. It was a plan that may have looked logical on paper, but struck a nerve deep in the soul of the city. White working-class families, many of them Irish-American and long established in enclaves like South Boston, saw the ruling not as progress, but as an invasion. Their children were to be sent to unfamiliar neighborhoods. The buses were a symbol, not just of integration, but of a distant authority imposing change on their lives. Resistance turned to rage. Television cameras captured the worst of it: screaming crowds, thrown rocks, racial slurs, black students escorted by police through gauntlets of hatred. One image in particular, of a white teenager assaulting a black man with an American flag during a protest at City Hall Plaza, became a haunting emblem of the times. A nation divided, even in the places where unity was supposed to be strongest. The busing crisis did not break Massachusetts, but it wounded it. The ideal of the liberal North was forever complicated. And yet, through the chaos, the protests, the courtrooms, and classrooms, something else began to happen. Conversations deepened. Coalitions emerged. Young activists, black and white, came of age in the streets and would carry the lessons of that struggle forward. But politics in Massachusetts has always walked hand in hand with power. And nowhere was power more visible than in the rise of one particular family, the Kennedys. Descended from Irish immigrants who had once been shut out of Boston's Brahmin elite, the Kennedys rose with the very tide that had lifted South Boston from tenements to City Hall. Joseph P. Kennedy, ambitious and ruthless, made his fortune in finance and real estate, and raised his children with one mission: to enter history. His second son, John F. Kennedy, would do just that. A decorated Navy veteran and Harvard graduate, Jack entered Congress in 1947, the Senate in 1953, and by 1960 became the youngest elected president in American history. To Massachusetts, his victory was personal. Here was one of their own, Catholic, Irish, sharp, and polished, taking the national stage not as an outsider, but as a symbol of what was possible. The Kennedy presidency, however short, reshaped American identity. "Ask not what your country can do for you," he declared. "Ask what you can do for your country." His call to service, his vision for space exploration, and his firm stance during the Cuban Missile Crisis all elevated him to the status of a modern icon. Yet it was his assassination in 1963 that transformed him into something larger, a martyr of modern America, frozen forever in promise. His brothers carried the torch. Robert F. Kennedy, first as Attorney General, then as Senator, took up the cause of civil rights and poverty. He walked with farm workers, spoke in black churches, and bridged the nation's widening divides. His own campaign for the presidency ended, like his brothers, in an assassin's bullet. Ted Kennedy, the youngest, would become one of the longest-serving senators in U.S. history. Though his career was marred by scandal, especially the 1969 Chappaquiddick incident, Ted became a legislative force advocating for health care reform, civil rights, and education. For decades, he was called the liberal lion of the Senate. He embodied the complicated legacy of Massachusetts politics: privilege and purpose, scandal and service, tragedy and tenacity. The Kennedy dynasty was not without critics, but its gravitational pull on Massachusetts and on American identity was undeniable. The family's compound in Hyannisport, the unmistakable accent, the blend of Catholic faith and political ambition, it all became part of the fabric of the state. And in many ways, their rise echoed the rise of millions of Massachusetts immigrants, starting from nothing, struggling against exclusion, climbing the ladder one rung at a time. But while the Kennedys held the national spotlight, other stories unfolded in the shadows, quieter, but no less important. The labor movement, once rooted in textile mills and immigrant unions, evolved into battles over pensions, teachers' rights, and living wages. Boston's universities became engines of research, but also flashpoints for anti-war protests and free speech debates. As the country shifted through Vietnam, Watergate, and the culture wars, Massachusetts found itself at the forefront, progressive in some ways, resistant in others. In 2004, Massachusetts made headlines again, not for rebellion, but for recognition. It became the first U.S. state to legalize same-sex marriage, following a landmark state Supreme Court decision. The ruling sparked national debate. But in towns and cities across the state, couples lined up to receive licenses, cheered on by friends and neighbors. For many, it felt like another chapter in the long story of Massachusetts, progress through courage, change through law, and the ever-expanding promise of liberty. And still, the state wrestled with its duality. It was home to Harvard and housing crises, to Nobel laureates and neighborhoods marked by poverty and addiction. It was a place of old money and new immigrants, of activists and institutions. Its past was never far away. Streets still bore the names of revolutionaries. Churches echoed the sermons of generations. And yet, every decade seemed to ask the same question: can Massachusetts live up to its own ideals? The answer was never easy, and perhaps that was the point. The 20th century in Massachusetts was not a story of steady triumph. It was a story of conflict, confrontation, and course correction. The busing riots, the Kennedy rise and fall, the protests, the policies, the people, all of it revealed a state constantly rethinking who it was and what it stood for. Massachusetts did not stand still. It argued, it voted, it reformed. It failed and tried again. Its citizens marched when necessary, resisted when provoked, and legislated when ready. It remained, as it had always been, a place of contradictions, revolutionary and rooted, radical and conservative, deeply proud and forever questioning. And as the century drew to a close, the streets of Boston, the mills of the Merrimack Valley, and the hills of Western Mass still whispered with old voices. Voices of those who had preached, fought, worked, and dreamed there before. In a nation struggling to define itself, Massachusetts had already been through it all: the battles for liberty, the fights for dignity, the collisions between power and protest. And though its scars were visible, so too was its resilience. The fight for what America could be had never really ended. In Massachusetts, it just kept changing shape. Chapter 11: The Rise of Tech and Academia. By the time the 20th century began to fade into its final decades, Massachusetts had already been many things. It had been a Puritan stronghold, a battlefield of revolution, a cradle of reform, a haven for immigrants, and a stage for political dynasties. But as the smoke cleared from the industrial age and the machines of the textile mills slowed to a halt, a quieter transformation began to take shape. Not with muskets or protests, but with minds. In the shadow of steeples and smokestacks, a new economy was taking root. One not built on cotton, coal, or cheap labor, but on ideas. And the unlikely capital of this intellectual revolution was a stretch of land just west of Boston, where a winding highway, known as Route 128, would soon become a symbol of 21st century innovation. But the seeds had been planted long before. Massachusetts had always placed a special value on learning. From the founding of Harvard College in 1636, education had been woven into the state's identity, not as an accessory, but as a moral imperative. Harvard was originally a training ground for Puritan ministers, but over the centuries, it grew into one of the most respected institutions of higher learning in the world. Its red brick buildings and ivy-covered walls stood as monuments to knowledge, tradition, and the power of critical thought. In nearby Cambridge, the emergence of MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, founded in 1861, offered a different vision. Where Harvard exuded classical scholarship and old-world prestige, MIT was something else entirely: experimental, technical, and unapologetically forward-looking. Its founding mission was to serve the needs of the industrial world, to fuse science with practical application, to invent rather than inherit. Over time, it would become one of the most innovative institutions on the planet. Together, these two universities, just across the river from one another, formed a kind of intellectual double star, one grounded in liberal arts and public discourse, the other in engineering, physics, and invention. But their influence did not remain confined to campus walls. As the Second World War erupted, the federal government began pouring money into research and development. And MIT, in particular, became a magnet. Its scientists and engineers worked on radar systems, navigation tools, and eventually played a key role in the technologies that helped win the war. The radiation laboratory, created at MIT, became a center of cutting-edge work. What followed was something few had anticipated: the permanent marriage of academic science and national defense. After the war, that momentum only accelerated. Federal grants, venture capital, and corporate investment flowed into the Boston area. Research hubs grew around the universities like coral, expanding into the suburbs, linking labs, startups, and government agencies. The once quiet roadways around Boston gave way to what would be called the Route 128 corridor, a loop of innovation, home to hundreds of high-tech firms. This was Massachusetts's new revolution, not one of musket fire or picket lines, but of circuits, silicon, and code. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Route 128 rivaled California's Silicon Valley. Companies like Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC, Raytheon, Lotus Development, and BBN Technologies helped create the architecture of the modern digital world. Mini-computers, early networking systems, defense technologies, and later software development flourished. Research parks replaced textile mills. Engineers replaced factory workers. What had once been an industrial economy was now a knowledge economy, leaner, faster, and far more global. At the center of this transformation remained the universities. Not only did they supply the talent, they shaped the very direction of thought. MIT was pioneering breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, robotics, and aeronautics. Harvard was influencing economics, law, and public health. Nearby institutions, Tufts, Northeastern, Boston University, Brandeis, and others, added to the momentum. The Boston area became not just a hub for degrees, but for discovery. Science was no longer an abstract pursuit. It was becoming the core engine of wealth, policy, and prestige. At the same time, medicine was undergoing its own revolution, and Massachusetts was once again at the vanguard. Massachusetts General Hospital, founded in 1811, evolved into one of the top medical institutions in the country. The Harvard Medical School pushed the boundaries of surgical techniques, genetics, and biotechnology. In Cambridge and Kendall Square, biotech firms sprang up beside academic labs, creating a dense ecosystem of research and application. By the 1990s, Massachusetts had become a global leader in biomedical innovation, a place where treatments were born, trials were conducted, and cures were chased. The same intellectual current that had once filled the pages of Thoreau and Emerson was now driving genome sequencing and pharmaceutical breakthroughs. Yet all of this came with new challenges. The rise of innovation brought wealth, but it also brought inequality. Cities like Boston and Cambridge glittered with opportunity, but many working-class families found themselves priced out, left behind, or overwhelmed. The transformation of the state's economy created winners and losers. High-paying tech jobs required degrees and connections. Neighborhoods gentrified, rents soared. Old identities were pushed to the margins. The same state that had once built itself on inclusivity through education now found itself struggling to balance access with excellence. Still, the pursuit of thought and progress remained central to Massachusetts' identity. The debates that once happened in church pulpits or town meetings now happened in lecture halls, think tanks, and TED Talks. The public square had become digital, but the spirit of intellectual rigor lived on. In the early 21st century, Massachusetts embraced its role as a laboratory, not just for science, but for public policy. The state launched one of the first universal health care programs, a model that would influence the National Affordable Care Act. It led the nation in environmental legislation, technology-focused education, and even space exploration partnerships. Its universities partnered with NASA, the Department of Energy, and private companies working on quantum computing, climate science, and synthetic biology. But the story of innovation was never just about machines and data. It was about people and the culture they created. Students came from across the globe to study in Massachusetts. Many stayed. The state became home to one of the most international and educated populations in the U.S. In cafes and labs, you could hear a dozen languages before noon. Ideas flowed across borders as easily as they did across campus quads. The intellectual intensity sometimes bred arrogance, the masshole stereotype, the prickly academic ego. But it also bred breakthroughs. In a world grappling with climate change, pandemics, and automation, Massachusetts didn't retreat. It researched. It didn't panic. It published. And in doing so, it helped shape the path forward. Yet even in the realm of intellect, the past never fully vanished. Walk through Harvard Yard, and you'll find monuments to colonial ministers and slave-owning benefactors. Walk past MIT's glass buildings and find streets once walked by laborers who never had the chance to enter. The contradictions remain. Prestige built on inequality, progress shadowed by injustice. But awareness grows. Institutions now reckon with their histories. They publish reports, rename buildings, expand scholarships. Reform, as always, comes slowly. Still, the arc of Massachusetts has always leaned toward inquiry, toward challenge, toward the belief that the world can be understood and improved by asking better questions. This is not a story of perfection. It's a story of pursuit. From John Winthrop's city upon a hill to the click of looms in Lowell, to the spark of revolution on Lexington Green, to the hum of servers in Kendall Square, Massachusetts has chased meaning through motion. In the end, it wasn't just the cannons of Concord or the speeches of presidents that made Massachusetts exceptional. It was the quiet force of the mind, working behind the scenes, shaping not just a state, but the future. Chapter 12. Massachusetts Today. Massachusetts today is a state of contradictions. It is a place where world-class hospitals and biotech firms rise beside neighborhoods where longtime residents are being priced out. It is the home of progressive legislation and stubborn inequalities, of towering intellect and lingering shadows. The Bay State, proud of its role in shaping the nation, now wrestles with what it has become in the 21st century and what it wants to be next. For many, Massachusetts stands as a symbol of American liberalism. This reputation didn't appear overnight. It was forged through decades of political activism, education policy, and public investment. From universal health care to climate initiatives, Massachusetts has repeatedly placed itself at the forefront of reform. In 2006, the state enacted a pioneering health care law under Governor Mitt Romney, yes, a Republican. that provided near-universal coverage for residents. It was a bold move that would later serve as the blueprint for the Affordable Care Act. This Romney Care law required individuals to carry health insurance and expanded Medicaid to cover more low-income residents. It also illustrated something deeper about Massachusetts politics, that here sometimes even conservatives speak a different language. Health care is just one pillar in the structure of modern Massachusetts. Education, long a source of pride, continues to dominate. The state consistently ranks at the top in national test scores, graduation rates, and college attendance. The emphasis on public schooling is visible in towns where local property taxes fund schools that are the pride of their communities. But this educational excellence is not shared equally. Wealthy suburban districts like Lexington, Newton, and Wellesley pour millions into their school systems, while urban districts, especially in places like Lawrence, Fall River, or parts of Boston, grapple with aging facilities and underfunded classrooms. It is a quiet daily reminder that even in a state built on Enlightenment ideals, opportunity is not always evenly distributed. The same can be said for housing. Walk through Cambridge or Somerville today, and you'll see gleaming apartment towers, artisanal coffee shops, and rents that climb by the month. These are the beneficiaries of the tech boom that sprouted along Route 128 and spread like ivy vines into Greater Boston. The once modest neighborhoods are now magnets for young professionals drawn by jobs in biotech, data science, and artificial intelligence. But for many longtime residents, especially immigrants and working-class families, the transformation feels like an eviction notice. Gentrification has pushed people out of their homes, redrawn the cultural map, and seeded resentment. In Roxbury, Dorchester, and East Boston, the pressure is acute. Where generations built lives, the cost of staying has become unbearable. Yet Massachusetts is not blind to these changes. State and city officials have tried, sometimes effectively, often imperfectly, to respond. Inclusionary zoning laws, rent stabilization efforts, and investments in affordable housing have been proposed or enacted. But in a region with limited space and insatiable demand, the pace of change rarely satisfies the urgency of need. The question of who gets to belong in Massachusetts is not just economic, it's racial. The state has long considered itself a bastion of tolerance. After all, it was the first to legalize same-sex marriage in 2004. It hosts the Freedom Trail, celebrates abolitionist heroes, and prides itself on voting blue. But underneath that progressive surface are fault lines. The Boston busing crisis of the 1970s may feel like distant history, but its echoes are still heard. Many neighborhoods remain effectively segregated, not by law, but by legacy. Black and Latino residents are disproportionately affected by poor schools, high rents, and limited access to capital. The state's criminal justice system, while reformed in parts, still reflects these imbalances. In 2014, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement stirred protests across Massachusetts. Thousands marched through Boston, Worcester, and Springfield. They carried signs, chanted for justice, and demanded that the state live up to the ideals it so often claims to uphold. The calls for change were not new, but the urgency felt different. Legislators responded with reforms to police training, body camera mandates, and re-examinations of use of force policies. Still, activists pressed on, arguing that real equity requires more than bills and commissions. It requires a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, the state's demographic landscape is shifting. Massachusetts, once dominated by Irish, Italian, and other European immigrant groups, is now home to growing communities from Brazil, Haiti, Cape Verde, the Dominican Republic, and Southeast Asia. In cities like Lowell, Chelsea, and Brockton, these new waves of immigrants have revitalized downtowns, opened businesses, and reshaped local politics. Multilingual ballots, cultural festivals, and city councils that look more like their constituents are becoming the norm. And yet, even as this diversity grows, so too does the debate over assimilation, identity, and representation. National politics has sharpened these debates. In 2016 and 2020, Massachusetts voted overwhelmingly against Donald Trump, rejecting his brand of populism. But that doesn't mean the state is immune to political tension. Rural communities in western Massachusetts sometimes feel ignored by Boston-centric policymaking. The cost of living, overregulation, and a sense of cultural alienation have led to a quiet but growing frustration. Even in a deep blue state, pockets of red remain, and they are not silent. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed and accelerated many of these divides. While the state's biotech sector played a key role in vaccine development, and its healthcare system mobilized quickly, the burdens fell unevenly. Essential workers, often immigrants or people of color, faced higher risks, lower pay, and greater job insecurity. Remote learning widened educational gaps. Small businesses shuttered. And while the state's economy has largely rebounded, many communities are still struggling to catch up. Despite all of this, Massachusetts remains a leader. The innovations born in its universities continue to shape the world. Its hospitals attract patients from across the globe. Its cultural institutions, from the Boston Symphony Orchestra to the Museum of Fine Arts, set national standards. Its athletes, Patriots, Celtics, Bruins, Red Sox, ignite fierce loyalty. And its voters continue to drive the national conversation, often serving as a preview of where America might be headed. But for all its influence, the state is still searching for a balance between progress and preservation, inclusion and tradition, equity and excellence. There are no easy answers. The problems of Massachusetts are, in many ways, the problems of the nation. Economic inequality, racial disparity, political polarization, and the ever-churning engine of change. What does Massachusetts stand for now? It stands for possibility, but not perfection. It is a mirror and a magnifier, a small state with an outsized impact, still trying to reconcile its proud past with its complicated present. It is the birthplace of revolution and the battleground of reform. And as it steps into the future, it carries the weight of its legacy and the promise of what might come next. In the end, Massachusetts is more than a collection of laws or landmarks. It is a living story, still being written, in classrooms and courtrooms, in subway stations and state houses, in protests and parades, in quiet homes and crowded streets. It is a place where history is never far behind, and the future is always just around the corner. And whatever lies ahead, one thing is certain: Massachusetts will not stand still. It never has. Epilogue: The Soul of the Commonwealth. Massachusetts has never been content to be ordinary. From its first days as a rocky outpost for dissenters and dreamers, to its modern place at the bleeding edge of policy, education, and innovation, the Commonwealth has carried something larger than its borders. It has become, in fits and starts, a mirror and a microcosm of the American experiment itself. In this sliver of land, this knot of towns and cities, shorelines and spires, one can read the story of a nation in all its contradictions. What began with Puritans chasing spiritual freedom quickly hardened into a society that prized obedience and control. The same ministers who fled persecution in England swiftly enforced their own strict dogma in the New World. And yet, it was here that radical notions of self-rule first took form. The town meetings, the early charters, the seeds of revolution, they emerged not in spite of that control, but from within it. This duality, freedom and order, has never left Massachusetts. It defines its DNA. When the cannon fire of rebellion cracked across the fields of Lexington and Concord, it wasn't just the British Empire that was being challenged. It was the entire hierarchy of how power moved and who could claim it. Massachusetts didn't just rebel for independence. It rebelled for an idea that common people could govern themselves, that rights could be declared and defended not by kings, but by neighbors. But that same state, just decades later, would see riots over the very meaning of freedom. The abolitionists of Boston fought a system of slavery that the federal government still protected. In the same city that had once cried for liberty, fugitive slaves were hunted. There was always a gap between Massachusetts' ideals and its realities. And yet, it was often the place most willing to wrestle with that gap. In the 19th century, the engines of industry roared to life in places like Lowell and Lawrence. Textile mills pulled in labor from distant farms and foreign shores. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and beyond built the state's cities even as they were denied entry into its halls of power. The working class, deeply Catholic and deeply excluded, clashed with the old Yankee Protestant elite. But over time, those same immigrants would come to define the political machinery of the state, forging a new identity out of struggle and survival. The face of Massachusetts changed, but its story remained the same. Outsiders turning the levers of power from the margins inward. In the 20th century, Massachusetts became synonymous with intellect. The universities of Cambridge and Boston were no longer just local centers of learning. They became global beacons. Harvard, MIT Tufts, Boston University. They drew the minds of the world into the orbit of the Commonwealth. Innovation pulsed out along Route 128 and into the world. Computers, life sciences, medical breakthroughs, and a new digital economy. The state's identity began to tilt away from smokestacks and union halls and toward labs and lecture halls. But even this transition was not without contradiction. The very brainpower that put Massachusetts on the world stage also deepened the divide between elite and everyday, between urban innovation hubs and forgotten rural towns. As one Massachusetts soared into the future, another was left watching from the ground. By the 2000s, the state had embraced its role as a progressive flagship. It legalized same-sex marriage before any other. It tackled health care reform and environmental protection. It spoke the language of equity and inclusion. And yet, beneath the veneer of liberal pride, tensions simmered. Neighborhoods gentrified, pushing out longtime residents. The wealth gap widened. Public schools in Boston fought over enrollment zones while private institutions flourished. Racial disparities in housing, policing, and health outcomes endured. Once again, Massachusetts found itself caught between its ideals and its actions. It wanted to be a model for the country, but struggled to be one for all its citizens. That, in essence, is the soul of Massachusetts. A relentless striving toward something better, even when it falls short. It has always been a place where contradictions are not just present, but foundational. A colony of the faithful that birthed secular governance. A hotbed of revolution that institutionalized elite power. A land of abolitionists that struggled with integration. A liberal bastion where class and race still carve invisible walls through its streets. But perhaps that is what makes it more than just a state. Massachusetts is a symbol. It represents the messy, unfinished, profoundly human work of democracy. It is a place where ideas matter, where speeches echo, where books are written, where protests begin, where policies are tested not just in the courts, but in the classrooms, the churches, the bars, and the kitchens of its people. And in that process, chaotic, imperfect, impassioned, it reveals something essential about America itself. The American story is often told as a march toward greater freedom and justice. Massachusetts shows us how jagged that march really is. It teaches us that rebellion and reform do not always walk hand in hand, that progress comes in loops and reversals. It reminds us that idealism must be grounded in the dirt of daily life, that every bold proclamation will face 1,000 quiet acts of resistance or indifference. Yet, despite everything, the people of Massachusetts have never stopped trying. They argue, they vote, they write, they organize, they build, they remember, they dream. In every town meeting, every student protest, every late-night lab experiment, there is a quiet belief that things can change, that the arc of history, while stubborn, still bends. The Commonwealth is not perfect. It never has been. But it is one of the few places in the world where perfection was ever dared, where minds came together and declared that the world should not simply be inherited, but remade, that rebellion could be righteous, that learning could be liberation, that freedom could be forged not just once, but again and again. And so, Massachusetts endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a compass, not always pointing north, but always pointing somewhere worth going.